It's been becoming more and more clear that the current system that we depend on is not very dependable. Whether this understanding comes from extensive research or from intuitive insight, it is undeniable that the global economy is not as stable as we'd like to hope. This economic system that we've invented is also destroying the ecosystem which we depend on, which we obviously cannot do forever. Anything that we cannot do forever is by definition unsustainable. There was a point where the human lifestyle was sustainable, when the human was a part of nature rather than a disruptor of nature. This was the era of the hunter-gatherer. At some point between our contemporary lifestyle and this hunter-gatherer era, we started going in the wrong direction. Transitioning out of this era was an inevitability, because although this way of living was sustainable, it was incredibly inconvenient. As an intelligent species, we're going to invent more efficient solutions to our problems. The solution that we invented to obtaining food was to farm. As we began to farm and settle into communities, we also began to build tools to solve our problems with less effort. As a consequence of limited access to certain tools, resources, and skill sets, people began to specialize in certain roles and trade for what they produced. People identified with individual roles that are necessary for survival, such as the carpenter, the seamstress, the farmer, and the blacksmith. This was the first time in history that people didn't fulfill each of these roles independently. Since two people didn't always have something of interest to one another, people recognized it was more efficient to have a medium of exchange with intrinsic value, which was usually gold or silver. Although advancements were made in this new system of trade and barter, people didn't seem to question whether or not this system was the most efficient solution to their problems. Had people contemplated this, they likely would have come to the realization that the most efficient solution was not to trade or work indefinitely, but to trade as a means to an end, the end being the point in which the worker develops the skill sets and obtains the tools and resources of whoever it is they are trading with. To understand how this principle is true in a historical circumstance, we could look to one of the earliest economies in history with documented economic figures, which was in ancient Rome. One of the most common occupations in this time period was the farm laborer. This laborer worked about 13 hours every day, usually 7 days of the week, and earned 25 denarii a day, which was around 9,000 denarii annually. A cheap apartment cost 300 denarii annually, and people usually spent about 200 denarii annually on clothing. The cheapest diet cost around 4,300 denarii annually and consisted of purely grains. A more balanced diet cost more than double that. The common farm laborer, who only supported himself, would usually spend most of his money on food and spend the minimum on any other necessary expenses, like rent and clothes. 12 of the 13 hours of daily work that this person invested went towards paying to eat. If this worker had access to his own personal farm, 2 to 3 hours of daily work would solve the same problem that he would solve with 12 to 13 hours as an employee. In this circumstance, the obstacle to this more efficient way of life are the tools and resources of the farmer, because this farm laborer already has the knowledge of how to farm. The farm tools used were the plow, sickle, rake, shovel, and hoe. They would usually cost about 20 denarii each, so the total cost of tools would be 100 denarii. The total cost of resources, including land, crop seeds, and livestock, would be around 2,000 denarii. This person could save this 2,100 denarii within about 6 months if they were to pay for the cheapest diet. The cost of tools and resources to build a modest home would be around 1,000 denarii, so it would take another 3 months of work to save that amount. It would then take another 12 months or so to build a modest home and to establish the farm. Within 18 months, this farm laborer was capable of positioning themselves in a way where they only had to work 2 to 3 hours a day rather than 13, only if they allocated their energy in the right place. Abraham Lincoln once said, "If you give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, I'll spend the first 4 sharpening the axe." It takes much less energy to sharpen an axe than to swing it, and yet this is the more efficient way to chop down a tree. In the same way, the most efficient way for this person to solve the problem of obtaining food was to invest their energy into obtaining the tools and resources of the farmer rather than to invest their energy into working for him indefinitely. The farm laborer, who invested about 12 hours a day into solving the problem of feeding himself, would end up expending about 175,000 hours of energy over his lifetime if he worked from age 20 to age 60. If this farm laborer only worked as a means to an end until he was able to develop the skill sets, tools, and resources of the farmer, it would take him about 2 years of work to position himself in a way that he only had to work about 2 hours a day to solve the same problem. This person would only have expended about 36,000 hours of energy over the same 20-year period. This is working smarter rather than harder. The excess 139,000 hours of energy, which is shown in the gray area on this chart, were only expended because this person failed to recognize that to learn how to solve this problem independently was the more efficient allocation of their energy. With an abundance of free time on this person's hands after making the transition to an independent lifestyle, they would now have the time to learn the skills of the blacksmith as well as obtain the tools and resources of the blacksmith, which might require temporarily trading with or working for the blacksmith in the same way that this person did temporary work for the farmer. This person would now have the time to learn how to sew their own clothes and obtain the tools and resources of the seamstress. In nearly any context, investing the time to learn how to solve your problems independently is a better return on investment of energy than paying someone to solve the problem for you. It has always been more efficient to solve our problems independently. Creating tools and advancing technology just created a short obstacle to a more convenient way of life. The problem with an economy is that it's established under the belief that the obstacle is the way of life. A modern example of this principle that most people can relate to is the example of an oil change. Most oil changes today require synthetic oil. A synthetic oil change costs about $85. Over the course of 10 oil changes, the total cost would be $850. To show how much energy was really expended in those 10 oil changes, we'll divide that figure by the median American's income. The median American makes about $16 an hour after taxes. $850 divided by 16 is 53, which means that over the course of 10 oil changes, the median American invests about 53 hours of energy into solving this problem. If this person were to change their oil independently, how much energy would be invested? If you were to break down the value of this service, you would have to break down the value of your mechanic's skill set, time, tools, and resources. The skill of learning how to change your oil can be learned in a 5-minute YouTube video. The tools necessary to change your oil are an oil filter wrench, which costs about $10, and a car ramp, which costs about $50. The resources are the oil filter, which costs about $7, and the oil, which costs about $25. It takes about 20 minutes to change the oil. After purchasing the tools for $60 and purchasing the resources for the next 10 oil changes, which cost $32 per oil change, you will have spent $380 on the same 10 oil changes that cost you $850 by going to a mechanic. If you divide that $380 by the median American's income, which is $16 an hour, you see that it's only 24 hours of energy expended. However, you have to consider the energy that you expended on the actual oil changes. If each oil change took you 20 minutes, that'd be about 3 hours of energy over the course of 10 oil changes. Add the 24 hours to the 3, and it comes out to be 27 hours of expended energy to solve the problem of changing your oil independently. If you subtract the 27 hours from the 53, you see that 26 hours of expended energy are only expended if a person fails to acknowledge that it is a better use of energy to change your oil independently. These excess 26 hours of energy are shown in gray on this graph. The principle that's being demonstrated here, just the same as the example of the ancient Roman laborer, is that it is a better use of energy to obtain the tools, skill sets, and resources to solve your problems independently. This principle is true in nearly any context, whether it's as micro as an oil change or as macro as building the car itself. The difference in building the car is that you can't gain access to the tools and resources the same way you can for an oil change, simply because a factory was not built for one person to use, and it certainly takes more than one person to build. However, if enough people within a community were willing to contribute a certain amount of money into paying to have a factory built for individuals to use within the community, then it would be plausible, and it would be a much better return on investment than for each member of the community to pay a corporation to build their car for them. The only reason anyone has to pay a corporation for anything is because the corporation has access to skill sets, tools, and resources that you don't. Once you gain access to those skill sets, tools, and resources, the corporation becomes obsolete. Another example of this principle that is relatable to most people is the example of how much energy goes into the construction of a home. To find the true cost of energy to pay for a home, we'll divide the median American's home cost by their hourly wage. The median American's home in 2021 cost $350,000. After paying interest, utilities, and all other expenses that come with purchasing a home, the real figure is much closer to around $550,000. When you divide the cost of the home by the median American's hourly wage, you find that this represents about 35,000 hours of expended energy, which is about 17 years of work at a full-time job. To find exactly how much energy goes into solving this problem independently is much harder to figure because it can vary so dramatically depending on the location of the home, what tools and resources a person has access to, and how a person chooses to solve certain problems. In the example that we'll create here, we'll use the median American who makes $16 an hour. We'll assume he doesn't have any prior knowledge of how to build a home, he doesn't own any tools, and doesn't have any available resources. The best investment of energy would be to build a cabin on a property with a water source and an abundance of wood, since the wood would be one of the largest expenses. In this example, we're going to imagine that this person is building a $350,000 cabin that is 2,000 square feet with 3 bedrooms. The tools that this person will have to purchase would be a sawmill, a chainsaw, a hammer and nails, a level and a square, a drill and a screwdriver, a table saw and a jigsaw, and a ladder. The total cost of these tools is likely going to be around $4,000, with the majority of this cost being the sawmill. Although most of the cabin he will be able to build with the resources that are on site, there are many that he'll have to purchase, such as the concrete for the foundation, solar panels and batteries for electricity, insulation, a water system, doors and windows, and most likely a few other small expenses. The cost of land could vary quite dramatically depending on a number of factors, but if this person wanted to find the cheapest land with the resources he needs, he could find it for close to $25,000. In this example, the total cost of resources would be about $42,000. If you add the cost of these tools and resources, it comes out to be $46,000. When you divide this amount by the hourly wage, it's just under 2,900 hours of energy. The skill sets necessary to construct a home can be learned online and will probably set a person back 2 to 3 months versus someone who already has the necessary skill sets. Including that setback, it will take around 3 years of energy to build this home if this person commits 40 hours a week. In those 3 years, this person will have invested 6,240 hours of energy. When that's added to the 2,900 hours, it rounds to about 9,100 hours invested, which is 4.3 years of energy versus 17 years of energy to solve the problem by working a job. The excess 12.7 years of energy are also shown in gray in this example here. In the earliest days of the economy, if people had recognized the inefficiency of a system of trade, they would have only used it as a means of getting to a place of independent problem solving. As more and more people began to make this transition to this independent lifestyle, the economy and government would begin to collapse because the system can only exist so long as people depend on it. If this awakening were to happen globally, anyone who isn't already living an independent lifestyle would be forced to make the transition. To calculate exactly what our world would look like today if this transition had occurred would be impossible. However, we almost certainly would have undergone a revolutionary period similar to the Industrial Revolution. This would be the period where the factory was invented, the tool that removes the human from the majority of the work process. It would not be a factory for corporate growth, but for communities to use at their discretion. The difference between our current world and this alternative world, if this had taken place, is that right now we pay for 95% of what we need, and we solve 5% of our problems independently. In a self-governing system, we would solve 95% of our problems independently and pay for about 5% of what we need. People wouldn't go down the street to Radio Shack. They would go down the street to the electronics factory where the tools exist for a person to build these electronics themselves. All tools and factories would be built by communities for communities, with no regulations preventing anyone from using them. Nearly every problem that we solve as members of an economy, we'd solve with significantly less energy in this alternative world. An economy has only been able to survive because of the collective illusory belief that it is more efficient to pay someone who specializes in a role rather than to specialize in the basic roles of survival independently. The message being communicated here is simply that an economy was an inefficient solution to a problem, and trade should always only happen as a means to an end in any circumstance that's possible.